All right, hi Science 10 students. We're going to do a whiteboard recording to help review for the midterm exam that's going to be coming up on November the 4th. And I can pretty much guarantee you if you watch this recording and practice all the questions on it, you should do well in the midterm. Okay, so let's get started here. And just checking out the picture here, can you guys imagine what it must have been like to look under the microscope for the first time and see living things moving for the very first time? That must have been totally amazing to do that. And a guy named Anthony von Leeuwenhoek was the first guy ever to see life under a microscope. Now at a certain point, scientists began speculating about what the building blocks of life were, and they came to the conclusion that the cell was the smallest unit of life. So they came up with a theory called cell theory, which summarized what they knew about the cell. And if you look at these 3 points here, the first point is the cell is the basic unit of life. The second point, cells divide to produce new cells. And the third point, all organisms are composed of one or more cells. So we know that some organisms exist as single-celled creatures. And if you look at this picture here, this is a paramecium, which is an example of a single-celled creature. But many other organisms exist as multi-celled creatures. And if you check out the next page, you can see, of course, there's a whole bunch of different multi-celled creatures, plants and animals and other ones as well. So now, since organisms such as a bacteria have one cell, and they can work or function as living things, that right there was evidence that the cell was the smallest unit at which any life on Earth could function. So because of the fact that the bacteria was one cell, and we knew it was living, that told us that the cell was the smallest unit. Now, we looked at different types of microscopes that people have made, and the light microscope I'm sure you're pretty familiar with. That's the picture right here. But there's some others as well. This microscope here is called the laser scanning microscope. And as the name suggests, it uses lasers to produce a three-dimensional image of the object being viewed. Now there's some things that are too small to be seen with a light microscope. And in this diagram, this is a picture of a cell. The ER stands for endoplasmic reticulum. So the endoplasmic reticulum is an example of one thing that's too small to be seen with a regular light microscope. Another thing that's too small is a ribosome, and ribosomes are where proteins are produced in the cell. So those two things right there are parts that cannot be viewed with a light microscope. Now we looked at electron microscopes, and electron microscopes can see things beyond the level of the cell. So when you're talking about things like a plant cell or an animal cell or a bacteria, all those things are one cell, and all those things can be viewed by a light microscope. But some substances like a protein molecule, which you can actually see in this picture here, cannot be viewed by a light microscope, but they can be viewed, proteins can be viewed by an electron microscope. And you can see some pretty cool images with electron microscopes. All right, now when we talk about how powerful a microscope is, we can talk about this power in two different ways. We can talk about its magnification, and we can talk about its resolving power. The magnification, as the name suggests, refers to how much the increased size of an object, how much its apparent size has been increased, so you're able to see it more clearly. A resolution, on the other hand, is the ability of a microscope to distinguish between two different points. Now, you can see these 2 points apart pretty clearly. Originally, when I took them, I made them in really, really small font, but somehow I accidentally made them in bigger font. But the main point is that the resolving power of a microscope is the ability to see 2 points as distinct points rather than looking like just 1 point. Okay, so that's what resolving power is all about. Now, what I've done here, guys, is I'm giving you some questions to review in blue. And later on, when you try these on the PDF file that I'm going to send out, you can try these. I'm going to tell you what the answers are here, but I want you to try them later on. So what I've done is, first of all, ask the questions without the answers. So when you have the PDF file, you won't have the answers there, and you can try them on your own. Okay, so let's look at what the answers are for these review questions that we've just gone over, the material we've just gone over. So question 1 says, how does the fact that bacteria are alive suggest something about what the basic unit of life is? Well, the answer is, since a bacteria is one cell and is alive, this suggests that a single cell is the basic unit of life. Question 2 says, what are the 3 statements that make up cell theory? The first statement, the cell is the basic unit of life. The second statement, cells divide to produce new cells. And the third statement, all organisms are composed of one or more cells. Okay, so those are 3 statements about cell theory. What parts of a cell cannot be viewed with a light microscope? 2 parts, the ribosomes and the endoplasmic reticulum. Next question, what type of microscope uses a laser to produce a 3D image? Now that one was called a confocal laser scanning microscope. So you can see that it's got laser right in the name. Laser scanning microscope. Produces a 3D image. Okay, question number 5, what's the difference between magnification and resolving power? Well, magnification is how much larger an object appears under the microscope, and resolution is the ability to tell 2 points apart. Okay. Moving on to another section now, we talked about the organelles of a cell. Those are like the different parts of a cell, structures of a cell, and they can be compared to the parts of a city. So this here is an animal cell. So I've got some questions here based on this animal cell, and we're going to look at the answers to them. So the first question was, which of the organelles is like the recycling plant of a city? And the answer is the lysosome. The lysosome breaks down waste material just like a recycling plant. Next question, which organelle is like the city hall, where decisions are made? Well, that would be the nucleus, because the nucleus controls the operations of a cell. Question 8, which is like the border of a city, which keeps certain things in and others out? Well, the cell membrane allows some things into a cell and keeps others out. Now, remember the difference between a cell membrane and a cell wall? Both animal and plant cells have cell membranes, but only plant cells have cell walls. The job of a cell wall is to provide strength and protection for the cell. Okay, so again, that's different from the cell membrane, which controls what comes in and out of the cell. All right, now what part of a cell is like the solar panel that captures energy for the city? Well, okay, this question is going to relate only to plant cells because chloroplasts in plants take energy from the sun and use it to produce chemical energy in the form of glucose. Remember, glucose is sugar. All right, question 10. Which organelle is like a post office? It processes and packages chemicals like proteins. And the answer for this one is the Golgi apparatus. So the Golgi apparatus is going to package proteins and modifies their structure. Okay, question 11. Which organelle is like a generator that changes fuel into energy? And that's the mitochondrion, because it uses glucose or sugar like fuel and burns it to produce energy. All right, so moving along, we're going to look at diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. So those 3 processes right there are 3 important ways in which substances move from one place to another within the cell. So let's focus on this diagram and look at the difference between diffusion and active transport. Okay, so diffusion occurs automatically without energy. And as you can see in this diagram, it's the movement of particles from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So why does it happen automatically? Because these particles in high concentration bump into each other and they spread to areas where there's not many of them. Okay, so again, it occurs without energy, and because of that, diffusion is also known as passive transport. Okay, so the other thing we're looking at is active transport. So again, it's the opposite of diffusion. It's the movement of particles from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. So again, that doesn't happen automatically. And it only happens using energy. And again, ATP is a special molecule that's a form of energy. So we see two different differences between diffusion and active transport. All right, now one example of active transport is the sodium-potassium pump. Okay, so this is sodium, Na+, K+ is potassium. And so again, it's an example of active transport. Remember that the sodium-potassium pump is an important system in our bodies, again, which is an example of active transport. Now, it involves a movement against a concentration gradient. In other words, it's going from low concentration to high concentration, and whenever you're doing that, you always need energy in the form of ATP. Okay, now we're going to look at osmosis. And remember that osmosis is just a special type of diffusion. Why is it a special type of diffusion? Okay, so we're looking at the diagram here. We see that, first of all, it involves the movement of water. So that's the particles that are moving with osmosis. It's water that's moving, and it's moving from a high concentration to a low concentration, just like any type of diffusion. The other thing is that osmosis involves a selectively permeable membrane. Selectively permeable means that the membrane only allows some substances to pass through and others don't. Okay, so remember, if we call a membrane permeable to salt, then it lets salt in and out of the cell. But if the membrane was selectively permeable, for instance, it only let water in and out, then salt would be left out. Well, in other words, salt could not come in or out. Okay, so if it was permeable to salt, then salt could come in and out. But if it was selectively permeable to water, that means only water is selected. Salt is not. Okay, now you can see here that the reason why water goes from this side to this side, because there's a sugar in it. If there's sugar in it, that means there can't be water on this side. So that means there's more water on this side, because water is more pure, you could say. So that's why water goes from this side to this side, because the water is more pure. There's more water molecules on the left side, and so it moves to the right, because of osmosis. All right. So, again, talking about salt again, if we're talking about a permeable membrane that's permeable to salt, we would call this an open system. It lets salt in and out. That's why it's an open system. Whereas a selectively permeable membrane is known as a closed system. That is, if it's selectively permeable and keeping out salt, only allowing water to pass through. Okay, we also talk about something called the dynamic equilibrium. Equilibrium means balanced, and it's the balanced movement of water and other substances. So, for instance, minerals could pass through and out, in and out of this, even though sugar can't. So it takes a while to get to a dynamic equilibrium. But eventually you get to a dynamic equilibrium. Now this is not a situation where particles are no longer moving. In other words, where you've just got a balanced state because nothing's moving. What's actually happening is you're having movement through both sides, but it's an equal amount of movement. So because of that, both sides are equal at that point when you've met the conditions for a dynamic equilibrium. All right. So remember, after a system has reached dynamic equilibrium, the molecules are going to look something like this. In other words, they're going to be as spread out as they can, evenly spread out. Whereas if you're talking about a concentration gradient, that's a situation where you've got a higher concentration on one side than another. These two pictures show a concentration gradient, right? You've got one area that has a concentration that's higher, whereas these two pictures do not. Things are more spread out in these two pictures. So again, be able to identify pictures that show a dynamic equilibrium and pictures that show a concentration gradient. All right, so we're going to look at some review questions, and again, these are ones that you could do when you print out the PDF file or when you look at it. So we're going to look at the answers now. So the answer to the first question, name 2 ways in which diffusion is different from active transport. Well, diffusion is going from a high concentration to a low concentration. Active transport is going from a low to a high concentration. Diffusion, again, it's passive transport. There's no energy involved. It happens automatically. Active transport requires ATP energy. Give another name for diffusion. We just talked about that, passive transport. All right. So, question 14, explain how a permeable membrane could allow salt through it while a selectively permeable membrane would not. Okay, so a permeable membrane allows salt in and out. Selectively permeable membrane that it only selects for water would prevent salt from moving in and out. Next question, explain how open and closed systems relate to the 2 types of membranes from the last question. A permeable membrane would be an open system. A selectively permeable membrane would be a closed system. Next question says define osmosis. Again, it's a special type of diffusion. It's the diffusion of water, and it's through a selectively permeable membrane. Question 17, define dynamic equilibrium. When the overall or net movement of water and other substances, such as minerals, on both sides of the membrane is the same. Okay, next question, compare how particles are spread out in a dynamic equilibrium to how they are spread out with a concentration gradient. Well, after a dynamic equilibrium, remember from those diagrams, we saw that the dots were evenly spread out. With the concentration gradient, we saw them concentrated in one area more than in another area. Next question, explain what type of transport system the sodium-potassium pump is and why this is necessary. Okay, I didn't actually write the answer here. The sodium-potassium pump is an example of an active transport system. And why does it have to have active transport? Because you're going against the concentration gradient. You need energy to do that, to go from a low to a high concentration. All right. So we're going to talk about the fact that organisms are organized starting at the level of cells and going all the way to organ systems. You can see that with this diagram here. You've got some cells. They form an organ, which here is a stomach. But you can see here that that's part of an organ system. The stomach working together with the intestines produce an organ system. So these are different levels, going from cells, tissues, organs to organ systems. And you can see that in the red text as well. So of course, tissues are made up of many cells working together to perform a similar job. Organs are many tissues working together to perform a similar job. And organ systems are made of many organs working together to perform a similar job. All right, so we looked at those different levels from cells to tissues, organs, organ systems. Now it's important to notice that plants go as high as organs, but they don't go as high as organ systems, whereas animals do. So plants might have reproductive organs, but they don't have organ systems. All right. Remember that with cells, because they're very small, diffusion is a good way of getting food from one area to another. But when a cell gets larger, the volume becomes significantly larger compared to the surface area. So what this means is there's kind of a limit to how large a cell can get. Diffusion is no longer a reliable way of moving food across because it would take too long to move it. And basically the cells would end up dying waiting for food to arrive. All right, so our next question here, we're going to fill in the blank. So we'll go to the next page where we see the answers. So many cells make up should be tissues. And many tissues make up should be organs. Many organs should make up, that should be organ systems. Okay, and the next question, compare the highest level of organization in plants to that of animals. Plants, organs are the highest level that you go, whereas animals you get organ systems. Question 22, explain why the surface area to volume ratio affects how organisms move their food. Well, the larger an organism becomes, or even like the larger a cell becomes, the larger its volume is compared to its surface area, and that makes it tough to transport food by diffusion. It just takes too long for the food particles to bump into each other and spread out. Okay, let's look at photosynthesis. Of course, that's a really important process. It's producing food from the sun's energy, and you can see using this that the sunlight is going into the plant and it's being captured to produce glucose or sugar. Alright, so photosynthesis is using energy from the sun to store this energy in the form of sugar. Here's the formula for photosynthesis. So the sun's energy plus water plus carbon dioxide are being used to produce two important things, glucose or food, plus oxygen. Remember, of course, photosynthesis only happens in green plants. Why are plants green anyways? Well, they have this pigment called chlorophyll in them, and this chlorophyll is found in a special part of the leaves called chloroplast. So that's where photosynthesis happens, is in the chloroplast. All right. So here again is the formula for photosynthesis. Now we've got two questions here, and I'm going to answer them here rather than on the next page because I've got the formula here. Name two reactants and two products in photosynthesis. Okay, so reactants are what we see reacting together on the left side of the equation. That's going to be water and carbon dioxide. What are two products? Well, of course, those are things that are produced in the equation, and that's glucose and oxygen. What part of a leaf does photosynthesis take place in? All right. So that one, of course, should be chloroplast. Okay, we're going to look more closely at some different structures in a leaf and the jobs that they carry out. We see here something called a cuticle. It's on the outside. That's a waxy layer on the surface of a leaf, which prevents water from being lost from the leaf. The next layer we see under that is the upper epidermis cells. Epidermis is like your skin, and as the name suggests, the top part of the leaf here is going to carry out the job of protecting the cell. Then we move on to the next section with palisade cells. Palisade cells are where photosynthesis takes place. If you want to try to remember that, remember palisade starts with P, and so does photosynthesis. That kind of matches those together. Now what do these guard cells and stoma do at the bottom here? Those are involved in gas exchange, so both carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay, so carbon dioxide comes into the leaf, oxygen leaves during photosynthesis. Now most of the gas exchange in a plant takes place in the leaves, in the areas that we looked at just now. Some gas exchange, though, takes place in the stem of a plant, and when it's in the stem, it's in the part of the stem called the lenticels. All right, now the gas exchange that occurs in plants is due to diffusion, and that makes sense, right? The gas molecules, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, are bumping into each other, and that's how they spread out. All right, so we're going to look at some more questions here. Question 25. Use one or two words to state the function of each leaf part below. So the cuticle, what does it do? It prevents water loss. How about the upper epidermis? Protection for the plant, or rather for the leaf, I should say. Palisade cells, again, remember P and P, photosynthesis. And I didn't write it out for the guard and stoma cells, but that should be gas exchange. All right, the next question. Explain the general part of a plant where gas exchange takes place. Of course, it's the leaf, and we saw that it's the guard cells and the stoma that are involved. Name the specific part that allows for gas exchange. Palisade cells. Okay, that should actually be relating to photosynthesis. Palisade cells. Okay, sorry, a little bit confusion there. Now, where in the stem cells does gas exchange take place? That should be in the lenticell cells. Alrighty. So we're going to talk about vascular tissues. Vascular tissues transport water, minerals, and sugar. Now, since water, minerals, and sugar are needed throughout the plant, it makes sense that the vascular tissues would be found in the different parts of the plant, in the roots, in the stems, and in the leaves. Now, there's two different types of vascular tissues, the xylem and the phloem. Okay, and you can see them in this picture, which is a cross-section of a root cell. All right. So the phloem is used to transport sugars, and the xylem is used to transport water and minerals. If you want to try to remember the difference between the two, just remember that P is closer to S, so P is sugars, and X is closer to W, so X, xylem, transports water. Now both the xylem and the phloem are part of what's called a vascular bundle. Okay, so the vascular bundle is the part that's transporting these sugars, water, and mineral. Now when we look at the xylem vessels, they're made of two different parts, the tracheids and the vessel elements. Okay, so we're going to look at a few more questions, and then we're done. All right, question. From where to where do you think phloem would transport the material it transports? Well, phloem is going to take sugar that's produced in photosynthesis in the leaf, and it's going to take it to the stem and the roots. Next question, from where to where do you think xylem would transport the material it transports? So we know that xylem is mainly transporting water. Well, where is water coming from? It's coming up from the roots, and it's going to go up to the stem and to the leaves. Question 29. Name the region that includes both the phloem and the xylem. That's going to be the vascular bundle. And question 30, name the parts that make up the xylem vessels. That's the tracheids and the vessel elements. All right, so guys, we're done. Thanks for watching this. I really want to encourage you guys to practice this on your own. Make sure you can get all these questions on your own. So do the PDF file, and where it's got the questions in blue where it doesn't have the answers, check them, and then later, if you go later on the PDF file, it does have the answers. So make sure you can get all of these questions on your own. If you do that, if you practice these over and over again so you can get all these questions, you should be able to do well on our midterm exam. Of course, midterms count a lot, so it's really important to do well in the midterm. And again, it's on November 4th. Hope you guys do well. Study hard. Have a great day. Take care, and God bless. Bye for now.